And if you have your Bibles, would you take them out and turn with me to Daniel chapter 7 this morning? Now, as we've been working through this study in Daniel, the primary focus is on what it means to live a life of honor, of spiritual honor. And we've been looking at this as we've been working through the first 6 chapters. And what's really interesting about Daniel's book is that it's split in half. And the first half, from chapter 1 through chapter 6, is almost all biographical. You just see these different pictures in Daniel's life for the 85 years that he lived. And each one of those snapshots, either through Daniel's life or the lives of those he's interacting with, represents some characteristic of spiritual honor. But then at the end of chapter 6, with the fall of Babylon and the Medo-Persian Empire taking over, there is a complete break in the approach of the book, in the topic of the book. And from chapter 7 through chapter 12, it's almost all theology. There's very little biographical information that's given after chapter 6. And you see one dream or vision after another that Daniel has, and he's explaining for us. It's all prophetic. It's just incredible. And so as we're moving into chapter 7, there's a complete change in the approach of the book that we're going to be looking at. And in chapter 7, we begin with this most unusual dream that Daniel had. Follow along either in your Bibles or on the screen, and we read, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Remember, he was the last of the Babylonian kings. He was a co-ruler, a co-regent with his father, and he ruled for 10 years. And in the first year that he was sharing in the rulership with his father, Abinadab, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of the dream. Daniel said, in my vision, at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Now let's pause for a second. As you read through the Old Testament especially, and sometimes even in the New Testament, the sea is a symbolic picture. Sometimes it's literal, but typically when you see the sea being referred to in the Old Testament or New Testament, it refers to the masses of people. So he's saying the winds are churning, things are happening, and the great sea of humanity was before me. And 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up from out of the sea. So the beasts represent rulers that are going to come up out of the people, out of the cultures of the world. The first was like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood up on 2 feet and was able to walk like a human being. And the mind of a human was given to this beast. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. Wow. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird, and this beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Now, let me pause again. When you hear the word horns, horns are often a symbolic picture of authority and power. We see this throughout the entire ancient world, even in Israel. There were horns at the altar, at the tabernacle and the temple. And kings often used horns as symbols of their authority and power. So this was very common, and this beast that was just mentioned has 10 different horns that represent power and authority. And while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up from among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. And this horn had eyes like the eyes of a human, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Now all of a sudden the scene changes from this sea of humanity and these incredible beasts to heaven. It's like watching a TV show or a movie where you're watching something that happens. All of a sudden there's a scene shift. And that's what happens here. After looking at all these beasts that are coming up out of the sea, there's a scene shift. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Who's the Ancient of Days? It's God, God the Father. As I looked, thrones were set in place. The Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was coming from out before him, and thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the court was seated, and the books were opened. And now the scene changes again. We come back to the earth and the sea and the beasts. And then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body was destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts, the other 3, the first 3, had been stripped of their authority, but they were allowed to live for a period of time. And the scene changes again. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. Now, this is Jesus. I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming from the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. And he, the Son of Man, referring to Jesus, was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and all peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion, Jesus' dominion, is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Wow. And I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the vision that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there, an angelic being, obviously. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. Now, isn't this interesting? Because the one person who was given the ability, apart from Joseph, to be able to interpret dreams was Daniel. And whenever somebody had this disturbing dream, whether it was Nebuchadnezzar or anybody else, Daniel was the one who was given the ability to interpret it. But now Daniel is having the dream, and he doesn't understand it. He can't interpret it. And so he asked this angelic person next to him what the meaning was of all this. And so he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that are going to rise up from the earth. And each of these kings also represent an empire of their own. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the 4th beast, which was so different from all the others and the most terrifying, with its iron teeth and its bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn, that little horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they, the holy people, possessed the kingdom. The messenger from heaven gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on the earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. That represents 3.5 years. Each year represents a time. Time, times, and a half a time. 3.5 years, this horn is going to be able to oppress the people of God. But the court will sit, and his power, the power of the little horn, is going to be completely destroyed forever. And then the sovereignty, power, and the greatness of all of the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and the rulers will worship and obey him. And this is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. That's the end of the dream and the story in chapter 7. Wow. As we're reading through this, and we're going to be looking at it this morning, we're just looking at the first part of it. And in reading to get the whole context, it's going to take 2 weeks. And next week, I'm not going to read the whole chapter again, but we're going to be looking now, between today and next week, at the 4 key players that are represented in this vision of Daniel's. The first one is the 4 beasts. Then the second is the little horn that's mentioned that comes out of the 4th beast. The 3rd key player is the Ancient of Days, which represents God the Father. And the last player is the Son of Man. And we see that that's Jesus. And this morning, we're just going to look at the 4 beasts and get an understanding of how all of this story impacts our lives as well. So we start with the first set of players here, the 4 beasts. And there are 4 separate beasts that come up out of the ocean, and they represent kings and empires that rise up out of humanity. The first beast, we're told, looked like a lion. It had eagle's wings. The wings were plucked from the lion, and it was lifted up and able to walk like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. That's the first beast. The second beast looked like a bear. It was raised up on its side, and there were 3 bloody ribs in its mouth. And this beast was told to rise up and devour much flesh, as a wild bear would. The third beast that rose up out of the sea of humanity looked like a leopard. But as much as it looked like a leopard, it also had 4 birds' wings on its back, and it had 4 heads. and it was given dominion over the earth for a time. And then finally, the fourth beast. The fourth beast was described as exceedingly dreadful or terrible. It had iron teeth and brass claws. It also had the 10 horns that represent 10 different kings with authority and power underneath this one last great beast. And it grew a little horn that broke off 3 and ends up being boastful as he takes control of the whole world. That's the Antichrist. And when we come back next week, we're going to start looking at how the Antichrist impacts the world, how the Ancient of Days, God the Father, and the Son of Man, that term that Jesus uses and applies to himself throughout the Gospels. When Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, he's not simply talking about his humanity. He is claiming the title that Daniel gives him, the Son of Man, who is going to be the ruler over God's kingdom forever. And we're told that these 4 great beasts are 4 kings, 4 empires that are going to rise up from the sea of humanity and rule over the earth at their times. Now, whether you realize it or not, we've already seen these 4 kingdoms that will come and go. In fact, in Daniel chapter 2, do you remember that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and it was so unsettling? He made the magicians, he said, "You're going to tell me my dream and you're going to tell me what it means." And nobody could until Daniel came. He says, "I can tell you what it was and I can tell you what it means." And there was this huge statue, and each section of the statue was made of some different material. And each section represented a different empire that was going to rule over the world at that time. The head was made of gold, and it represented the Babylonian Empire. Then the chest of silver represented the Medo-Persian Empire, and that was the empire that conquered Babylon. But then as you move down the statue, the midsection represented the Macedonian Empire, the legs of iron represented the Roman Empire, and finally we got down to the feet with the toes that were clay and iron, and they were mixed together. That represents the divided kingdoms and modern powers that exist to this day. When Joseph was in prison, and the Pharaoh was struggling because he had this terrible dream of cows coming up and then corn and all this other stuff that was so unusual, 2 different dreams. And they heard about Joseph in prison who could interpret dreams. Joseph came and said he heard both different dreams. He says, "Oh, King, Pharaoh, you've had the same dream just in 2 different ways. And God gave you it a second time to absolutely confirm what's going to happen." This is the same thing that's happened in the book of Daniel. First, God gave this vision to Nebuchadnezzar, and now God has given it to Daniel. By repeating it, it's only confirming for us the absolute certainty of what's going to happen. And the 4 beasts represent the same empires that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his statue dream. The first beast, the lion, represents the Babylonian Empire. The second beast, the one that looks like a leopard, represented the Medo-Persian Empire. The third one that looks like a bear represents the Macedonian Empire. And the fourth one that is so awesome and so terrible with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze represents the Roman Empire. And God was saying through Daniel, this is the confirmation that everything that I gave to Nebuchadnezzar in his statue dream is true, and it's going to happen with certainty. And so we have these 4 beasts that look so terrible and are so oppressive to the world, all represented together with Nebuchadnezzar's dream. All right, now, if you're looking at this, you can say, wait a minute. Nebuchadnezzar actually saw 5 different empires. Why only 4? That's where the little horn comes in. The little horn, who is the Antichrist, is going to be the final ruler of the last kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar saw. He isn't here yet, but he's coming. This is not just a spirit of the world. It is a single ruler who is going to dominate and control the entire world at some point. We'll see that next week when we come back. Now, what's really important is that we understand that this is not the end of humanity. In fact, do you remember when we were looking at Nebuchadnezzar's vision and dream? There was a giant rock that came and smashed all the other kingdoms, and the rock grew into a mountain, and the mountain consumed the world. And that was the last great empire in God's great eternal plans. It's the kingdom in which Jesus is going to rule and reign over the entire earth. In Daniel 2, we read, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it ever be left to another people. It will crush all those secular, ungodly kingdoms and bring them to an end, but the kingdom of Christ will never end. It will endure forever." Whoa! And then all of a sudden we find out in Daniel 7 that is confirmed again. In Daniel 7, verse 14, the Son of Man, and that's that title of deity that is given to Jesus. The Son of Man was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. And all nations and all peoples of every language worship him. His dominion is an everlasting kingdom. He is the rock, and his kingdom is the mountain that consumes the whole earth. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will never pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Wow. Now, when we're working through this, and we're going to be looking at those other key players next week, dealing with the Antichrist, the little horn, God the Father, who is the Ancient of Days, and Jesus, who is the Son of Man, and we're looking at this vision, this dream that is really overwhelming and terrifying. And you go, all right, that's pretty significant stuff here, but how do we make this a practical understanding and part of our own spiritual lives here today? Because all but the last kingdom has already come and gone. So what are we supposed to learn from this, and how are we supposed to apply this to our lives? And I think as you're studying through this chapter and you see this vision with all these terrible beasts, and then you have this understanding and promise of a last kingdom that is going to consume the earth, that will be ruled by the Son of Man, Jesus, there are 2 very important truths that are revealed in all of this, these big foundational truths that impact every one of us here today. And the first one is that God has revealed his future plans for us in the Bible. See, I don't have to wonder what's going to happen in the world. How is it all going to end? Oh, is there going to be some terrible plague that's going to be happening? Is there going to be an asteroid that will destroy everything that you see in movies? Or are we going to be all taken over by zombies, No. God has already revealed for us his whole plan for humanity, all the way into eternity. In fact, this is so interesting. In Amos chapter 3, verse 7, we read, "The sovereign Lord never does anything until he reveals his plans to his servants, the prophets." God has everything already mapped out, and he's already revealed all of his great eternal plans for us. And it's given to us in prophecy. I like to describe prophecy as history that's written in advance. It's all going to come true. In the mind of God, he already sees it as an accomplished fact. And he's communicated it with certainty to the prophets who've recorded it for us. Now, it's so interesting as you're reading through the Bible and you're studying this concept of prophecy. It might surprise you to know that between 25 and 30, between a quarter and a third of the Bible was written as prophecy, where God was giving information to the prophets. And prophecies relate to nations, individual people, even cataclysmic events. And all of this information that's being communicated through the prophets have details that absolutely no human person could have known ahead of time. Even to the point of specific names. When God says, I'm going to send Cyrus, who's going to take over the Babylonian Empire. You go, wow. God has given us all these incredible details to help us understand what his eternal plans are. Now, some of those prophecies are given with such clarity and specificity that you just go, okay, that's what's going to happen. But the challenge of prophecy, when you're reading some of the prophecies that are written, especially in a passage like Daniel chapter 7, where it's also cryptic and oppressive in terms of the beasts and all the rest of it, there are some challenges that make it difficult to deal with the prophecies. For example, there's symbolism that's often represented in the scriptures when we deal with prophecy. The beasts are symbolic pictures of kings and empires that come up. And by the way, all four of these are found in Daniel 7. The symbolism, the apocalyptic literature that represents these dark and oppressive and scary kind of things that are going to happen. The fact that there are scattered prophecies. It's not just in Daniel 7 that you read about these prophecies. You read about them in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and then in all the prophets, in the Psalms. When we get to the New Testament, Paul writes about these things. Then John writes about them in Revelation. And someday when I get to heaven, I'm going to have a talk with God. I'm going to say, God, why did you have all these different prophecies scattered all around the Bible so that we'd have to pull them together and kind of figure it all out? God, if you had asked me ahead of time, I could have helped you with this and had you put everything in one simple passage, one chapter that would have all made sense. And God's going to look at me and say, Steve, go back to your seat. Why did he do it that way? I don't know. But that makes it a challenge for us to understand prophecy sometimes, because it's all spread out and we have to figure out how it all fits together. And then another aspect of prophecy that makes it challenging is that there are often time gaps within the same story, within the same prophecy. Something is happening here, and there is an element that happens way over here. Let me show you a visual picture of what this looks like. When you're looking at prophecy in the scriptures, it's like looking across a set of mountain peaks. And every one of the mountain tops represents a prophecy that's given to us. But the problem with looking across mountaintops is that we don't see the valleys in between. We don't know how big they are, that we don't know how deep they are. All we see is the mountaintops. And the same thing is true with prophecy at times. You see a prophecy that's given about this kingdom that represents Rome, with all these 10 horns that represent 10 kings, and then all of a sudden a little horn that grows up. And it ends up consuming the others and taking control of the whole earth for a time. Well, the prophecy of the fourth beast is over here on the left side. And then all of a sudden you have these 10 kings and the little horn, and that's on the next. It's all represented within the same prophecy, but it's like looking at mountain peaks. And there's a whole valley in between that has already lasted for 2,000 years. And so you have this huge time gap, and because some people struggle dealing with the time gaps, they go, oh, well, that must mean that the emperors, whether it would be Augustus or any of the other Roman emperors, must have been the Antichrist. And so they struggle because they don't see the valley in between the mountain peaks of time. But as you read through, whether it's the prophets of the Old Testament or Paul in the New Testament who talks about the Antichrist, or John in Revelation, we see that there's this huge gap of time between when the prophecy started dealing with the fourth beast and the final kingdom that represents the ruler over the 10 toes of clay and iron that's mixed together. Wow. So as we're approaching prophecy, it's really critical for us to understand, and this vision that Daniel has is a great confirmation of the fact that all of these things that God has revealed through the prophets are going to happen with certainty. And so biblical prophecy is important for us because it is the prediction of events, future events, as God already knows that they're going to happen. How does God know it? Because he's eternal and omniscient. God already lives. God is not bound by time like you and I are. God already lives and exists in eternity. And what's future to us is the present to God. What's past to us is the present for God. God is always existing in the past, present, and future. He is always the I am, not the I was or I will be, but the I am. And so God is already there in the future. And God already sees these things and knows that they are going to happen and is communicating through the prophets, whether it's Daniel or Isaiah or Jeremiah or Paul or John, exactly what's going to happen. But this is really critical to understand. God is not simply communicating what he knows is going to happen. He is also using prophecy to predict the future events as he plans for them to happen. And this is where it gets challenging for us. It's one thing to say God knows it, but when you're reading about these beasts and so many of the tragic and terrible things that are going to happen, and you go, wait a minute. God is communicating what he plans for things to happen as. And that's what leads us into the second big truth that's important for us to understand today, and that is the fact that God is in control. He doesn't simply know what's going to happen. He is in control of every single part of human history and every future event that's going to happen. God is in control, and everything is working to accomplish towards his eternal plans. In Ephesians chapter 1, we read that God works out everything, categorically everything that happens in the world, everything that happens in our lives. God works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will or his sovereign and eternal plans. Wow. This is confirmed in Isaiah 46, where we read God saying through Isaiah the prophet, I alone am God. I am God and there is none like me. Only I can tell you the future before it even happens. And everything that I plan will come to pass, for I do whatever I wish. And I have said what I will do, and I will do it. Wow. But that's a little unsettling, let's be honest, because you're reading about these beasts that trample over people and devour them, and they're violent empires. And you're going, wait a minute, does that mean that God is responsible for all the violence that's going to happen in these empires and in the future? Is God responsible? If he plans it, does that make him a culprit with those violent kings? And the answer is no. It is absolutely critical for us to understand. people are not violent. Kings and kingdoms are not going to be oppressive because God makes them that way. We made ourselves that way with sin. Violent people are not violent because God makes them violent. They are violent because of their sin nature that is running amok inside of them. Now, this is absolutely critical for us to understand. And God has already determined where human history is going to go and how it's going to end. And when you have these violent empires, whether it's the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, or the Roman Empire, or what's going to happen under the Antichrist, all of these happen because of the sin nature in man, and God is simply able to use them. In fact, here's a verse that you'll be struggling with while you eat lunch today. In Psalm 76, verse 10, David writes and says, even human wrath, and he's dealing with anger and violence, even human wrath will praise you. Other translations use the phrase, even human wrath will bring you praise or enhances your glory. For you, God, use it as a weapon, referring to judgment. So when God wanted to deal with Israel, here's this violent Babylonian Empire. And he says, you're already violent, I'm going to use you. And then he still holds them responsible for their violence. But God says, I'm going to use you as an instrument of judgment over my people. You are able to use even violent people for your sovereign purposes. You use the anger, the violence of sinful people to accomplish your eternal purposes, but God is not responsible for the violence in them. And this is one of those really challenging divine paradoxes. God is always perfectly holy. God is always in control, but there is with mankind a personal sense of responsibility that we have for who we are and what we do with our lives. And when you're trying to work this out between the sovereignty of God and the free will of man, think of it like this. The picture here is a highway. Let's imagine that we're all driving into Chicago on 94, and there are 3 or 4 lanes. We're all heading the same direction, right? In the free exercise of our wills, we have the ability to choose what lane that we want to drive in. We have the ability to choose how fast we're going to drive, and we have the ability to choose what kind of car we're going to be in, right? That's where freedom comes in. But in God's sovereignty, he's already decided that the direction of human destiny is heading to Chicago. And when you're looking, whether it's at Nebuchadnezzar's vision or you're looking at Daniel's dream, within the freedom of human will, these are kingdoms and kings that choose to be violent. But God has clearly determined the direction and end of human destiny as a whole. And he's going to use the Babylonian Empire. He's going to use the Medo-Persian Empire. He's going to use the other empires. And finally, after all of them have exhausted the single few moments in time that God is going to give them, there's going to be a last great kingdom that's going to rise up. The kingdom of the rock and the mountain. The kingdom of the Son of Man. God has already decided that's how it's all going to end. Let me share a cartoon that I love that kind of helps us deal with these challenges that we're looking at today. It's a Peanuts cartoon that Schultz did years and years ago. And Lucy and Linus are in the house. It's pouring down rain. And Lucy says, "Boy, look at it rain. What if it floods the whole world?" Linus responds and says, "It will never do that. In the 9th chapter of Genesis, God promised Noah that would never happen again, and the sign of the promise is the rainbow." Lucy responds and says, "You've taken a great load off of my mind." Linus then responds and says, "Sound theology has a way of doing that." I love it. I love it. You look at these beasts. You look at the violence of the world that we live in, and you go, "Oh, it's all going to be destroyed and it's all going to take over us. What are we supposed to do when we can fall apart?" Or we can read our Bibles and understand how God has all of this under control. And God has already decided and determined this is how it's all going to end. I don't worry about all these apocalyptic movies that come out about how the world's going to be destroyed. Although I am a little concerned about the zombie revolution thing still. I said, no. Sound theology says that I don't have to be afraid. Sound theology says it's not going to all fall apart because an asteroid or nuclear war or anything else is going to destroy the earth. Sound theology says one day God has a spiritual kingdom that's going to consume the earth. Jesus is going to rule and reign that kingdom, and those of us who are his children by faith in Jesus are going to be a part of that kingdom. Sound theology has a way of doing that. And I'm okay. I'm okay with that. The promises of God, the prophetic promises of God, are all great promises that God has already determined. He already sees it as an accomplished fact. And this is really important. When I'm looking at the vision that God gave Nebuchadnezzar of the kingdoms and how it's all going to end with the rock and the mountain and the spiritual kingdom, when I'm looking in Daniel chapter 7 and I see these kingdoms that are represented by these violent beasts, and then all of a sudden the Son of Man is going to have a kingdom that's going to rule over the earth forever and ever and ever. The fact that the first four kingdoms all happened exactly, they came and went exactly as God gave Daniel. Whether it's interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream or in his own dream. The very fact that those four kingdoms, and now we're into that fifth one, happened exactly as God said they were going to, gives me a sense of confidence that the last kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus, is going to happen too. I don't worry about it. I just don't worry about it. Because I have placed my trust in Christ, because I have believed with all of my mind and heart and soul that in his suffering and death he paid the penalty for my sins. Because I have placed my trust in Jesus, I have absolute confidence that one day I'm going to be a part of that last great kingdom that will last forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And so can you. Prophecy is great if we understand how it all works. It has practical and powerful implications for every one of us because God has given us hope in those promises. And that's why Isaac Watts, the great hymn writer, was able to say, I believe the promises of God enough to venture an eternity on them. He said, I believe God's redemptive promises and his kingdom promises so much that I am willing to bet my whole future on them, and I'm going to trust Jesus. And if you're here today and you've made that commitment to Christ, you're a part of that kingdom that's going to last forever and ever and ever as we see Jesus ruling over the world. If you haven't made that decision yet, God has made it clear what's going to happen. And he gives you the opportunity to decide whether or not you're going to commit your life to Christ and trust in him and be a part of that kingdom, or you're still throwing the dice thinking that you're going to be able to figure all this out on your own. And if you haven't made that decision yet, as your pastor, as your friend, I just implore you, choose Jesus. Choose Jesus. Simply say, Jesus, with all my heart and soul and mind and strength, I give you my life. I believe that you died for me. You give me new life, forgiveness, and restoration in my relationship with the Father. And that's what this is all about. Next week when we come back, we're going to pick up here, and we're going to look at the next three players. The little horn, which is the Antichrist, the Ancient of Days, which is God the Father, and the Son of Man, which is that redemptive title of Jesus. All right? So let's pray, and we'll plan on seeing you next week, all right? Father, thank you for your